The first words my husband spoke to me after disappearing for 12 years were not an apology. They were, "You've done well considering." He stood in my doorway like a stranger wearing a memory I no longer trusted. His suit was expensive now, his hair thinner, his confidence sharper. Like time had polished away the parts of him that once hesitated before hurting someone. Beside him stood a young attorney with a tablet tucked under his arm, and a smile that had probably closed more deals than friendships. "We're here regarding Ethan's financial assets," the lawyer said, "as his biological father, Mr. Lawson, has legal standing. Financial assets." Such a clean phrase for something that had been built from sleepless nights, borrowed money, and quiet tears no one ever witnessed. Behind me, in the small dining room of our Indiana house, my stepson sat at the table, paint drying on his fingertips, eyes steady in a way that felt older than 17. My own lawyer, Mrs. Hargrove, leaned close and whispered, "We can fight this. Abandonment is well documented. He doesn't have the leverage he thinks he does." But something inside me had grown tired of fighting long before that morning. "Let him take it," I said. The words surprised everyone, especially me. For a moment, the room froze. Then Ethan spoke softly, calmly. "Let me handle it." That was when I realized the boy I had raised wasn't a boy anymore, and the past we had survived together was about to speak for itself. 12 years earlier, my life had split in two over a cup of burnt coffee. It was a Sunday morning, church bells drifting through the neighborhood, the smell of toast and rain on the pavement. My husband stood at the kitchen counter, car keys in his hand like they were a passport to another life. "I can't do this anymore," he said. I remember thinking he meant the mortgage or his job at the auto plant, or the way Ethan screamed when the vacuum cleaner ran, but he meant us. "There's someone else," he added. He didn't raise his voice, didn't cry, didn't even look particularly ashamed. He simply explained in the same tone he once used to discuss weather forecasts that he deserved happiness. "And your son?" I asked. The question hung between us like a test he had already decided to fail. "He needs more than I can give," he replied. "You're better with him." Then he left, just like that. The screen door slammed. His car pulled away. And suddenly I was standing in a quiet house that felt too large for breathing. Upstairs, Ethan was rocking on his bed. He was 5 years old, small for his age, eyes wide with the confusion that doctors later explained was sensory overload, but felt to me like heartbreak. The diagnosis had come months earlier. Autism spectrum disorder, high support needs, words that turned grocery shopping into strategy and bedtime into negotiation. At first, I thought I would follow my husband, pack a bag, find an easier life somewhere that didn't require learning an entirely new language of patience. But that night, when Ethan crawled into the hallway and sat outside my bedroom door without saying a word, I understood something simple and terrifying. Leaving would be easier. Staying would be right. So I stayed. The years that followed were not heroic. They were practical. Working late shifts at a diner where regulars tipped in coins and sympathy. Filling out Medicaid forms at the public library because we couldn't afford internet at home. Learning which grocery brands tasted the same every time because consistency meant peace. Ethan spoke very little, but he drew constantly. Crayons first, then pencils, then stolen pens from my apron pocket. Barns, windows, empty porches under enormous skies. Sometimes I wondered if he was painting loneliness. Sometimes I wondered if he was teaching me how to survive it. And slowly, without either of us announcing it, we became a family built not from blood, but from choice. Until the day his paintings began to change. Until the day the world began to notice. Until the day the man who left us behind came back to claim a future he had never helped build. The first time I noticed Ethan's drawings had become something more than coping. It was late on a humid July night. The diner had closed early because the air conditioning unit finally gave up. I came home smelling like grease and disappointment, my feet throbbing in shoes that had outlived their purpose. The house was quiet. Too quiet. For a moment, panic rushed through me, that old instinct that something had gone wrong while I was gone. Then I saw the light under the dining room door. Ethan sat at the table, hunched over a canvas that looked far too serious for a 12-year-old boy. He didn't look up when I entered. His brush moved slowly, deliberately, as if each stroke required permission from some invisible authority. "You working on, sweetheart?" I asked. No answer, just the soft scrape of bristles against cloth. I stepped closer. The painting showed an elderly man sitting alone on a wooden porch at dusk. One hand rested on a cane. The other shielded his eyes as he stared down a long, empty road. The sky behind him wasn't blue. It was the color of waiting. I felt something tighten in my chest. "You saw him somewhere?" I asked gently. Ethan shook his head. He pointed at his temple, then at the canvas. That was his way of saying he lives here now, Mrs. Calderon from across the street noticed the paintings first. She had taught art at the local high school before retiring and still wore paint-stained cardigans like a badge of honor. "You can't keep this hidden," she told me one afternoon after I reluctantly invited her in. Ethan hovered in the hallway, anxious around visitors but curious enough not to retreat. "This isn't hobby work," she continued, studying the canvas like she was reading scripture. "This is expression most adults spend their lives trying to find." I didn't know what to do with praise. Praise doesn't pay therapy bills. Praise doesn't calm a child who melts down in grocery store aisles because fluorescent lights feel like lightning. But Mrs. Calderon began bringing supplies. Used brushes, half-empty tubes of oil paint, a folding easel that smelled like decades of classrooms and stubborn dreams. "Let him speak," she said. "He already knows what he wants to say." Money was always the quiet third person in our house. It sat at the table when I balanced checkbooks at midnight. It followed me into doctors' offices where insurance coverage felt like a game designed to humiliate. When Ethan turned 14, I started worrying about something new. What would happen when I was gone? I was already pushing 60. My knees ached in winter. My blood pressure pills lined the bathroom shelf like tiny reminders that time doesn't negotiate. So I began planning. Legal guardianship research at the public library, savings accounts with whatever tips I could spare, document folders labeled in careful handwriting. If life had taught me anything, it was this. Love without preparation is just hope wearing a blindfold. The turning point came at the County Arts Fair. It was held every September on the courthouse lawn. Funnel cakes, quilt auctions, bluegrass bands, playing songs older than regret. Ethan almost didn't get out of the car. Too many sounds. Too many strangers. His hands flapped nervously, a habit he'd never quite outgrown. "We can go home," I told him. He looked at the canvas on his lap, then at me, and for the first time in years, he took my hand voluntarily. We stayed. 3 hours later, a blue ribbon hung from his painting. People gathered, whispered, asked questions I answered poorly. Then a woman in a tailored linen suit handed me a business card. Midwest Contemporary Gallery, it read. "We'd like to talk about representation." Opportunity felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Exciting, terrifying, unavoidable. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He painted until sunrise. And as cicadas sang outside our open windows, I realized something that made my stomach twist. Success has a way of waking ghosts. And somewhere out there was a man who once walked away from this child. A man who would eventually hear about the millions and come looking for a piece of a story he had never stayed to finish. The first time we took Ethan to Chicago, I packed like we were going to war. Extra clothes, noise-canceling headphones, his favorite peanut butter crackers. Copies of medical documents I had carried for years like protective charms. We left before sunrise. Indiana farmland rolled past the truck windows in quiet shades of gold and green. Ethan sat beside me, knees pulled close, sketchbook balanced on his lap. He drew constantly when he was anxious. Telephone poles, silos, a dog chasing nothing across an empty field. I kept talking even when he didn't respond. "Big cities are loud," I said, "but we'll take it slow. No rushing, no pressure." He nodded once. That was enough. Midwest Contemporary Gallery occupied the third floor of a renovated brick warehouse near the river. The lobby smelled like coffee and polished ambition. White walls, bright lights, paintings hung like declarations. The woman from the county fair, Marianne Pierce, greeted us with a handshake, firm enough to make me trust her just a little. "We don't want to change him," she explained after watching Ethan study a large, abstract canvas with intense concentration. "We want to give him structure, protection, space, protection." That word mattered more than fame. I had spent years shielding Ethan from a world that mistook difference for weakness. If art was going to become his future, it had to come with safeguards. Contracts were discussed, trust structures, guardianship recognition, royalties. I listened carefully, asked questions. People probably assumed I was too small town to understand. Hargrove reviewed every clause with the determination of someone who had seen families fracture over less. "It's legitimate," she told me finally. "More importantly, it protects him." So we signed. Not because we dreamed of wealth, but because we feared what would happen if we didn't. The first exhibition was held the following winter. Snow piled against curbs like folded blankets. I bought a new dress from a discount rack and spent 20 minutes figuring out how to use mascara again. Ethan wore his gray sweater, the one he insisted was lucky. People came, more people than I had imagined could care about paintings. They stood in front of his work quietly, a barn collapsing into twilight, a bus stop with no passengers, a single porch light glowing like hope refusing to quit. "You can feel the silence," someone whispered behind me. Another said, "He paints what most of us are afraid to admit we feel." I swallowed hard because they were right. They just didn't know how much those feelings had cost him. The auction came the next spring in New York. I had never been farther east than Ohio. Skyscrapers made me dizzy. Taxi horns sounded like arguments that never ended. The auction hall felt like another universe. Velvet chairs, crystal lights, people who discussed millions the way we once discussed grocery coupons. Lot de 14. Evening vigil. A painting of a woman sitting at a kitchen table long after midnight. A single lamp illuminating unpaid bills and a cup of cold coffee. My breath caught. It was me. Not literally, but spiritually. Bidding started at $50,000. I almost laughed. It felt unreal. Then the numbers climbed. 100, 200, 500,000. I stopped counting somewhere around 1 million because my heart wouldn't slow down. When the hammer finally fell, the screen displayed $900,000. Applause filled the room. Cameras flashed, hands grabbed mine, and congratulations. But Ethan didn't celebrate. He stared at the painting like he was watching part of his childhood disappear forever. Fame arrived faster than peace. Reporters called the diner asking for interviews. Neighbors suddenly remembered our names. Financial advisors spoke in complicated sentences about investment portfolios. I checked bank statements at night like they might vanish by morning. And deep inside, an old fear began to stir. Because success does something dangerous. It shines light into places that were once safely forgotten. And somewhere I knew there was a man who would see that headline. A man who once walked away from responsibility. A man who might now decide he wanted a share of the reward. The only mystery left was how he would return and what he would demand when he did. He didn't call first. He didn't write. He didn't even pretend to ease his way back into our lives. He simply showed up. The morning was cold enough to sting. I was on the front porch sweeping last night's leaves into a crooked pile when a silver sedan rolled slowly into the driveway like it already owned the place. I knew that car didn't belong to anyone on our street. I also knew before the engine even stopped that the past had finally come to collect. My husband stepped out. 12 years had carved lines into his face, but hadn't softened his confidence. He looked well-fed, well-dressed, well-practiced at being someone who expected doors to open. A younger woman stayed in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead like she was part of the upholstery. Then the lawyer got out. Briefcase, tablet, smile sharp enough to cut rope. "Margaret," my husband said, using my name like it had been waiting on his tongue all this time. I leaned the broom against the railing. "You're early," I replied. "I didn't realize you were coming back." He ignored the tone. His eyes moved past me into the house, calculating. "Is he here? Not how is he? Not can I see him?" Just confirmation that his investment still existed. "Yes," I said. "He's painting." The lawyer stepped forward before my husband could say another word. "My client intends to reestablish his legal and financial role as Ethan's father," he explained. "Given the minor's recent earnings, we believe there is significant entitlement involved." Entitlement. Such a clean word for something so dirty. I invited them inside because that is what you do in small-town America, even when people bring storms with them. Ethan sat at the dining table, same spot where he once lined up toy cars to calm his mind. Now canvases surrounded him like quiet witnesses. He didn't look up right away. He finished the brushstroke he was working on first. That alone unsettled my husband. "Son," he began, voice suddenly warmer, rehearsed. Ethan's shoulders tightened. I saw it instantly. 12 years of absence cannot be erased by one carefully chosen word. Mrs. Hargrove arrived shortly after, breathless from climbing the porch steps too fast. "They filed preliminary notice," she whispered. "We can fight this. Abandonment laws are on our side. He has very little chance if we push, fight, argue, drag this boy through headlines and courtrooms and strangers dissecting his childhood like a case study." I felt something inside me sag with exhaustion. For years, I had carried the weight of survival. Now I was being asked to carry the weight of victory too, and suddenly I wasn't sure I had the strength. "What if we don't?" I said. Mrs. Hargrove blinked. "Don't what?" "Don't fight." Illness spread across the room. My husband straightened slightly, hope flickering in his expression. "You're being reasonable," he said. For once. 12 years of sacrifice reduced to a convenient personality flaw. But I didn't respond to him. I looked at Ethan. His hands were trembling, not violently, just enough to remind me that beneath the headlines and auction records, he was still the child who once hid in closets when voices got too loud. "I don't want this to hurt you," I told him quietly. I don't want them turning your life into evidence. Then I turned to my lawyer. Let him take it. The words fell heavier than I expected. Mrs. Hargrove stared at me like I had just surrendered a war she had already prepared to win. My husband exhaled slowly. Relief, triumph, validation. But before anyone could move forward, Ethan spoke. Stop. Just one word. Clear, measured, final. He stood up taller than his father now and walked to his room. When he returned, he carried a thick folder I had never seen before. Inside were copies of therapy invoices, school incident reports, letters addressed to a father who never answered, and legal documents stamped with official seals. I prepared, he said. His voice didn't shake. You left, he added, looking directly at the man who had once abandoned him. I learned how not to be left again. For the first time since arriving, my husband looked uncertain, and I realized this wasn't going to be about money anymore. This was going to be about truth. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Not grand, not dramatic, just a rectangular room with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lights that hummed like tired insects, the kind of place where real lives are quietly rearranged. Ethan sat beside me, hands folded in his lap, the way he had taught himself to sit during therapy sessions years ago. Controlled, grounded, present. Across the aisle, my husband stared at a stack of documents as if they might rearrange themselves into victory. His lawyer whispered strategies. Mrs. Hargrove whispered patience, but Ethan whispered nothing. He was saving his words. The judge, a woman with silver hair, pulled into a tight knot, adjusted her glasses, and began reviewing the case summary. Biological fathers seeking financial and parental rights, she read. Documented absence exceeding a decade. Substantial earnings placed in protective trust. Substantial earnings. Again, that phrase as if money were the most important thing being discussed. When the judge invited Ethan to speak, I felt my pulse climb into my throat. He stood slowly. 17 years old. Shoulders no longer hunched. Eyes steady in a way that had taken a lifetime to learn. I don't hate my father, he began. The courtroom shifted. Even the air seemed to lean closer. I just don't know him. He handed the bailiff a set of papers. These are therapy notes, he explained. They show how abandonment affected me. Panic episodes, communication delays, sleep disorders. He didn't dramatize, he didn't accuse. He simply told the truth like an artist choosing colors carefully. These are letters I wrote, he continued. They were returned unopened. My husband's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he had no explanation ready. Then Ethan reached the heart of it. My paintings are not accidents, he said. They are records. He described how art had helped him understand feelings he couldn't speak, how routine had built safety, how presence, quiet, consistent presence had created trust. He turned toward me. My stepmother stayed, he said. 3 simple words. They carried more weight than any legal argument. Then he addressed the money. My earnings are protected by a trust, he explained, created with legal counsel when I was 16. It names Margaret Lawson as financial guardian until I am 18. He paused. I choose her, not because biology required it, because life had proven it. The judge nodded slowly. The ruling came without theatrics. The biological father's financial claim was denied. Parental authority remained limited. The trust would stand. But the real ending happened outside the courthouse. Reporters gathered like birds sensing bread. Microphones extended, questions shouted. Ethan ignored them. He walked straight to his father. The man who had once walked away now stood uncertain, smaller somehow. "I will not give you money," Ethan said gently. My husband swallowed. "I understand," he replied, though his voice suggested he didn't. "But you can come to my next exhibition," Ethan continued. "You can see who I became." Silence stretched between them. Then my husband nodded. Not triumphantly, not even gratefully, just honestly. It was the first real moment I had ever seen from him. Life didn't transform overnight. Healing rarely announces itself, but small changes began to appear. My husband attended the exhibition. He stood in the back, hands in his pocket, studying canvases that told stories he had once refused to hear. Later, he helped carry lumber when the old feed store downtown was converted into Ethan's first studio. No speeches, no promises, just work. One evening, as the sun faded into soft Indiana gold, Ethan and I sat on the porch with 2 cups of weak coffee. "Were you afraid?" I asked. "Always," he said. "Of him." He shook his head. "Of losing you." I felt something inside me settle that had been restless for years. If this story has touched you, if you've ever stayed when leaving would have been easier or chosen responsibility over comfort, take a moment to reflect on the quiet power of showing up. Share this story with someone who believes love is proven through action. And if you'd like to hear more stories about justice, resilience, and second chances, consider subscribing and becoming part of Learn English by Stories. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not winning. Sometimes it is raising someone kind enough to forgive. The end.